My name is Don.Unger. I'm an assistant professor of writing and rhetoric at the University of Mississippi. My presentation is titled Action, Adventure, Fantasy, LGBTQ, Sexuality and Gender Identity and Expression in Elfquest. My title refers to the terms that Dark Horse Comics uses to categorize EQ. They are action, adventure, fantasy, and LGBTQ. Since 2014, Dark Horse has published EQ's ongoing series and republished collected editions of earlier material under the moniker The Complete Elfquest. Interestingly, Dark Horse changes the categories it uses to define Elfquest depending on whether the publication is in print or digital. The print editions are described as either action-adventure, fantasy, or simply fantasy, and the digital editions are described as either action-adventure, fantasy, LGBTQ, or fantasy, LGBTQ. I note these differences because they mirror a debate about EQ. Some people deny the series' LGBTQ content, including readers who identify as part of the LGBTQ community. Here are a couple examples. On Tumblr, North Star Fan argues, quote, "There is LGBTA representation, but it's largely incidental, not the best executed, and not given near the same weight as the het-presenting couples," unquote. And on Twitter, user Panic Volkushka argues, "Who else liked Elfquest as an adolescent and only retrospectively realized that while there are poly ships, there were no LGBTQ elves?" However, other fans applaud EQ's LGBTQ content and argue that the comic was foundational to developing their own identities. For example, at Jeffrey Cubbage tweets, quote, "All these conservatives out here trying to ban real-life story graphic novels when everyone knows it's Elfquest that turns you polyqueer," unquote. Also on Twitter, at Coriandersaurus says, quote, "Some people would think me reading Elfquest as young as I was bad. I argue it taught me to be a badass queer warrior, and while I might not be poly, the series normalized it for me." These posts prompt me to ask, what is an LGBTQ comic? What do LGBTQ narratives look like for characters who aren't struggling with their identities, rights, representation, or senses of community? For characters who don't need to come out and who feel no guilt or shame in acting on their sexuality. In this presentation, I argue that EQ explores some possible answers, drawing from the series, academic articles, comics journalism, and fan letters in order to illustrate how elves in EQ are queer, or what Madeline Gangnes and Kevin Cooley call elfqueer. As Gangnes and Cooley argue, the elves evoke a queerness that escapes the limits of contemporary LGBT identity politics. I begin with an intro to EQ, then I dig into particular scenes from the comic. Finally, I discuss how readers reacted to this content and how the Pinis addressed those reactions. Doing so allows me to get at how EQ's publication and its reception mark it as a queer comic. In 1977, EQ's creators, Wendy and Richard Pini, pitched the series to Marvel, DC, and other publishers who all turned the Pinis down, calling the material, quote, "too weird," unquote. Eventually, they found a publisher, and in February 1978, Fantasy Quarterly #1 featuring Elfquest was released. However, the quality was shoddy and the Pinis struggled to get paid for their work. Within months of Fantasy Quarterly's release, the Pinis established their own publishing house, Warp Graphics, and self-published the series beginning with issue #2. Wendy recalls being told, quote, "Elfquest was the wrong size, fantasy didn't sell, self-published books didn't sell, black and white didn't sell, women artists didn't sell, we cost too much, and we published every 4 months. We were repeatedly told how we would never survive," unquote. Despite a rocky start, by the early 80s, EQ was a smash hit, selling 100,000 copies an issue and outselling some of Marvel and DC's mid-level superhero titles at the time. The comics industry was stunned by the success because no one had seen anything like EQ before, both in terms of the content and its success. For the next 25 years, the Pini's self-published EQ, assisted at times by other companies, and since 2004, DC and later Dark Horse have reprinted the series and published new stories. EQ takes place on the world of two moons, a planet similar to, though decidedly not, Earth. The comic book chronicles the story of Cutter, chief of an elf tribe called the Wolf Riders. His quest, reflected in the series title, changes as the story progresses. In the first 20 issues of the series, dubbed the Original Quest, the Wolf Riders are burned out of their forest home by a group of humans. Cutter leads his tribe across a vast desert in search of a new home. On their journey, the Wolf Riders discover another elf tribe called the Sunfolk. Thereafter, Cutter's quest shifts towards locating more tribes and finding the elves' ancient home, the Palace of the High Ones. He aims to bring all elves together and to make their ancient home accessible to any elf who wishes to return to it. The Pinis have always referred to the series as both a hero's journey and an epic romance. In recent years, they have clarified that the romance they have been referring to involves Cutter and Skywise, Cutter's best friend and advisor. In the preface to the collected edition of Stargazer's Hunt Volume 1, published last year, Richard states that, quote, Elfquest has been an ongoing love story, not, as you might suspect, between Cutter and Lita, but rather between Cutter and Skywise, unquote. In the preface to the second volume, Wendy writes, quote, the relationship between Cutter and Skywise, that love story, was the cord connecting all the vertebrae in the tale's backbone. Were that dynamic to ever be mishandled, no other part of the epic would function, unquote. For 44 years, readers have watched Cutter and Skywise's psychosexual drama play out. At times, other elves make note of this drama. For example, the graphic novel Elfquest in All But Blood, published in 2001, collects 4 stories about Cutter and Skywise's relationship. In one story, titled The Heart's Way, we see a dalliance between Skywise and 3 female elves, Verda, Raphael, and Madeline. In the course of their encounter, they ask Skywise if he were to choose a life mate, who would he choose? It's clear that Verda is sincere in her inquiry and not simply flirting. She questions Skywise about the nature of his relationship to Cutter, because she sees Cutter as her competition. Skywise responds, quote, male wolves mount each other for sport, it's true, but I prefer what maidens have, unquote. Verda doesn't believe him, so she approaches Lita, Cutter's life mate, for advice. Lita states that, quote, Cutter and Skywise are more than friends, more than brothers, indeed. I think it's possible their souls were mated even before they walked this world, unquote. Lita not only accepts the relationship, she admires it. Some readers interpret the Heart's Way to mean that Skywise is essentially straight, but such a reading ignores the complex feelings that pansexual elves, or people, might have about their attractions and their preferences related to sexual acts, not to mention the struggles that pansexual people might have in dealing with other people's insecurities. As another example, in the final quest, issue number 13, Cutter believes he is at death's door, and he offers a soliloquy about Lita and Skywise, part of which reads, quote, love mates, life mate, soul brother, I searched for who we are, found out more than I can bear. The quest has gone too far, unquote. As the Pini state in the FAQ on Elfquest.com, quote, love mates can be 2 or more elves joined for pleasure. In today's terms, they'd be friends with benefits, no strings attached, unquote. Cutter applies the term to both Lita and Skywise, while he uses the terms life mate and soul brother to qualify the deeper relationship he has to each elf respectively. This example may be subtle, but the series is filled with similarly subtle scenes about characters' relationships. In issue number 5 of the original quest, published in 1979, we first meet Verda, Raphael, and Madeline in a panel where they're flirting with Skywise. Some readers argue that the panel depicts polyamory, but not pansexuality. Reading the panel as such denies the elf women agency. It asks the reader to assume that were the foursome to hook up, the female elves would simply wait in line for their turn at Skywise. Such an interpretation says more about the reader's attachment to compulsory heterosexuality than it does about the panel itself. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't address the infamous orgy scene from the original Quest, published in issue number 17 in 1983. Again, some readers argue that the scene illustrates polyamory but not pansexuality. I point toward a panel on page 14 where we see Skywise embracing a group composed of 2 females and 1 male elf in the foreground, while Redlance and Nightfall embrace another male-female couple in the background. Again, I argue that assuming that the elves will only engage in heterosexual acts reduce all sex to the act of penetration, particularly penile vaginal penetration, something that is never depicted anywhere in EQ. As Richard states in a 1981 interview in the Comics Journal, quote, "If someone is looking for throbbing orifices and bloated appurtenances, they're not going to find them," unquote. Such a reductive reading all but demands that the Pinis depict penetration so that the reader can police elf sex for evidence of hetero or homosexuality. It demands that the reader be allowed to see whose appendages penetrate whose orifices before deciding if the elves are queer or queer enough. To reduce sexuality to penetration also reduces LGBTQ representation and identity to penetration. If that were the case, then a whole lot of LGBTQ people would be excluded from the community. At the time, the orgy scene caused quite a stir in the letters pages published in EQ issue number 18. Reactions ran the gambit. Some readers took issue with the polyamory depicted in the scene, others took issue with the depiction of pansexuality and or homosexuality, and some argued the scene was inappropriate for children. Conversely, others argued that it provided a space for parents to begin to address sex and sexuality with their children. In response, Wendy addresses how the elves are closer to, quote, sexual freedom and equality, unquote, than humans are. In interviews, the Pinis have long made clear that the elves are polyamorous and pansexual, even as they use different terms. Quote, "The elves are quite liberal about sex. Remember, in issue 5 of the original Quest, Saba suggested to Rayak that there be a triangle between him and Lita and Cutter, which he rejected because of his ego problems. But it's not uncommon for elves to do what we would term fool around a lot. They are long-lived people who do not necessarily mate for life," unquote. Later, in a 1994 interview published by the Comics Journal, the interviewer asked Wendy and Richard about one of the artists working on EQ titles at the time. The interviewer fears that artist Barry Blair might make some of the elves homosexual. Richard corrects the interviewer, stating that openly gay characters are already, quote, there, but understood that there are no such labels in this culture, unquote. To which Wendy adds, quote, "I'm going to come right out and say that every single blasted one of our characters is bisexual," unquote. More recently, in keeping with contemporary identity labels, the Pinis have identified the elves as pansexual. However, as I noted at the outset of my presentation, the question of EQ's LGBTQ content persists. The refusal to acknowledge EQ as LGBTQ extends beyond the series to include Wendy herself. In 2016, she came out publicly as pansexual. However, the series rarely gets included in lists of queer comics. That is to say, on lists of comics created by an LGBTQ person and or comics about queer characters. Over the years, the comics press has given Wendy a lot of attention as a, quote, woman in comics, unquote, particularly early in her career. And EQ is often cited as a success story for both women creators and for having brought many women into comics fandom. Additionally, EQ gets recognized as one of the first comics widely available in bookstores and libraries. Still, identifying EQ as a queer comic would mean readdressing the series history and the history of queer comics, because the series may well be the longest lasting and most popular LGBTQ comic in the US to date. In making this claim, I urge folks who study queer representation in comics to evaluate some long-standing assumptions, such as the idea that queer comics have largely been a niche and not a driving force within the comics industry until recently. Academia has largely ignored the series. To date, academic journals have published 3 articles about Elfquest. I hope my presentation prompts you to study the series and delve deeper into its content, its impact on fandom, and the role it has played for some queer creators. You can read the series, the first 35 years of the series, for free at elfquest.com. All of the artwork in my presentation is copyright Warp Graphics. Thank you.